welcome to Asian Ethnology Podcast. My name is Ben Dorman and I'm the co-editor of Asian Ethnology. Today my guest is Patrick McCartney, who is an anthropologist, originally from ANU and now based in Japan, who's studying on the subject of global yoga. Patrick, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work and actually what it involves?
Well, a long time ago when I was a kid, I couldn't walk properly and the doctor sent me to a physio who gave me a bunch of stretching to do every day. 2 hours of stretching, 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour at night. And anyway, fast forwarding along, I ended up getting involved in going to yoga classes and became a yoga teacher. Got a scholarship from the Indian Council of Cultural Relations after I finished my bachelor's degree in archaeology and thought I'd go off to India and study yoga at a university there. So I did that and fell in love, I guess, in many ways with India. What happened? Learned Hindi, started learning Sanskrit and things like that. And just kind of, I guess I've been pulling at a piece of string. And so I worked for many years, maybe 20 years on and off sporadically, sometimes more intensely trying to teach yoga and run a yoga business and things like that. Failed spectacularly at being a yoga business empire, but so that's probably why I ended up in academia, I think, because of that. But yeah, I just got more and more interested in things, and there were more and more questions that I became interested in, especially with, I've spent 7 years, I think, all up, if I've counted correctly, the amount of time I've lived in India studying and traveling and working and things like that. And so I've seen a few things here and there, and it just made me even more curious about global yoga. So, I mean, that's what's happened. I've started working on global yoga, which in the last maybe 5 or 10 years has become a bit more credible as an academic discipline. So I consider myself as someone that works in part within the field of yoga studies. And so that's primarily where I base myself as an anthropologist or a linguistic anthropologist. Is probably, if I had to qualify it, an extra step, because I'm also quite interested in the Sanskrit language and not only exploring it as a living language and how it survives within India's linguistic ecology, but also how it's used as a kind of cultural and political kind of instrument by the Indian state. And, it's a heritage language for many people, and it has a lot of symbolic value and prestige. And this flows over into the world of yoga, into the world of global yoga, or euphemistically what we refer to as yoga land. So this is something of an emic term that yoga practitioners around the world use to either refer to it pejoratively or affectionately or something in between. It depends on the context. But so I look at yoga land. I have different ways of exploring yoga land, and that one has been cyber ethnography. So I have spent a lot of time in the last 18 months just more or less hanging out as deeply as possible in different Facebook yoga groups, some of which have more than 20,000 members, and that's been a very productive way to get to know people, to get involved with discussions and things like that. Some have got very heated, and it's interesting to just to get involved, especially because during that time I had no actual money to go off and do any field work. So it was more of a pragmatic decision. It was, what can I do? So I did that.
Ethnography.
Yeah, this stuff. And that comes with its own kind of, drawbacks, and
sure.
The methodology kind of evolved, and, I think there's some ethical things you probably don't consider initially, and so that, it's been interesting to explore that. But currently I'm in Japan at Kyoto University, and I've been here since November 2017. I'm here for 2 years to look at yoga in Japan. What I mean by that is essentially comparing what we know about global yoga with what I will find out about yoga in Japan. So when I talk about global yoga, I mean essentially the global yoga industry, which is worth billions of dollars. And you could consider that that it's situated within a multi-trillion-dollar wellness industry, which includes tourism for, spiritual tourism or secular tourism. It includes tourism for health reasons. So many people will go to India, for example, to, go to some type of yoga, meditation, Ayurveda retreat, where they'll have all of these kind of Panchakarma and Kaya Kalpa, the typical Ayurveda treatments, plus maybe learn some yoga and things like this. And so that kind of falls within medical tourism in some ways as well. I mean, all these things kind of cross over.
So that industry, the tourism industry, you're referring specifically to India, but not to other countries? Or?
So that's what I was looking at in the last couple of years, but fate would have it that I've ended up in Japan, and during the application for the fellowship, I started thinking, well, if this fellowship is for Japan, then perhaps I should look at yoga in Japan. And then then of course, you can already see the questions and, well, what do we know about yoga in Japan? And quite quickly I realized that nothing is written on yoga in Japan. From an anthropological perspective, of course, there are many scholars who are working on, Buddhism and Indological kind of focus of ancient medieval India and things like this. But, and there's also a lot of scholars, like physiologists and kind of this applied health science kind of focus that in Japan that, are working on trying to understand how yoga could be applied to diabetes or, depression or things like this. So, I mean, that's something completely different to what I'm working on, which is basically taking more or less a utopian framework to understand the aspirations of consumers of yoga in Japan and to compare and contrast that with global yoga. So because we don't know anything yet, it's a bit hard to say, but initially, I mean, I've just been doing some field work in Tokyo, and that involved attending yoga classes, meeting with yoga teachers, trying to speak to also their students and things like that, because I want to understand many things. I mean, what's the aspiration behind, signing up to do a yoga class? And do they intend to maybe go ahead with deepening the yoga journey as it's kind of cliched into, it's a spiritual journey for a lot of people. And for many people, it's not. It's just something they do because that's how you perform some like middle class consumption, these types of things of creating prestige. I mean, as you know, every country has its own kind of state authorized narrative of its history and things like this, and yoga obviously has a quite central part, I think, in India's soft power strategy to create legitimacy for itself through cultural capital. We have the Vivekananda Center for Culture that the Indian Embassy runs yoga lessons out of, but you can also look at the Ministry of External Affairs, the Ministry of Tourism, and Ayush, which is an acronym for more or less the Ministry of Health. And they have some interesting ideas about the historicity, I guess, of yoga. And I mean, for instance, essentially, if you follow them all the way through, you more or less see government websites saying, denying that the out of Africa theory is anything but a fantasy, and in actual fact, humanity started in India, and this Vedic-speaking Sanskrit group colonized the entire world.
Okay, so there's a strong nationalist.
There's a huge nationalist stuff. So I get quite interested in this banal consumption of nationalism and how these seemingly discrete, separate worlds of like Hindu nationalism, Hindu supremacism, and yoga land, how they kind of intersect in different ways, in ways that you might not kind of necessarily think. and especially the kind of the average consumer of yoga who's, I would say, more or less doing it as a form of as a way to re-enchant their disenchanted life. There's some magic that yoga affords. It has I think an interesting epistemology to it in the sense that there was a woman today who in this yoga class, and she said that she was sitting by the river this morning before she came, and she realized that there's water. Most of our bodies are made of water, and there's this exchange of air, and that yoga for her was about being in a constant flow. So, of course, there are many reasons why people come to yoga. And so it's quite hard to kind of pinpoint it for everyone. I mean, anyone you ask will say something different. So this is one of the main questions that I have is, why do you do yoga?
When you say global yoga, what are we talking about?
Yeah. This is a very interesting question, and so I'll try my best to answer it in the shortest way possible. So when someone says, I do yoga, or do you do yoga, kind of thing, when they ask me, I need them to really clarify what they mean by yoga. In a sense, I guess a lot of people just think yoga is stretching, going to a yoga class with a yoga mat, having a latte afterwards with your friends, this type of thing. It's stretching, it's a bit of fitness, it's a bit of fun, maybe you sweat, maybe you relax, you get out of your head, you get these endorphins. I mean, you can, I think, experience that in any really kind of physical activity. And this is one of the criticisms against global yoga in its kind of postural focused frame, is that it's not the complete yoga of traditional yoga. And so then you ask, what's traditional yoga? But I mean, there are many scholars that have written things like Mark Singleton, who wrote Yoga Body, and Elizabeth de Michelis's A History of Modern Yoga. And I mean, there are other scholars who have, Elliot Gould is another one, who have written what are essentially kind of books that probably the Indian government, or anyone who is more or less like a fundamentalist yogi, who could be of any ethnicity really, would consider heretical.
Okay.
And so maybe we don't have time to talk about the history of modern yoga, but more or less it's evolved in the last 150 years, and it was also part of a political movement in the independence movement to get rid of the British. So a lot of people will say, this yoga's got nothing to do with politics. And it's quite interesting how that narrative is woven into, what is the legitimate disposition for a yogi. It's otherworldly, it's life-denying in a sense. The aim is beyond the tangible, and so politics are just going to sully that or slow down that spiritual journey. So if that's yoga for some people, is sitting in a cave. For other people, it's getting involved and being politically active. But on the train from Tokyo to here, I was reading some comments on Facebook, and people were saying, getting involved in activism is something that you shouldn't do. I mean,
well, that's activism in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah. So, yeah, of course. I mean, and even saying I'm apolitical is a political stance, right? So, it gets quite tricky. But, I mean, you can even take it back all the way to like the earliest texts of Hinduism, and in the Vedic texts, you've got this idea of yoga, so which has got nothing to do with stretching or even attaining any type of salvation. It had the first mentions of yoga based on a martial application of, uniting a bow to an arrow to kill your enemy, uniting an ox to a cart so you can go off and kill your enemy, uniting your prayers with the martial god Indra so he could go and destroy your enemy.
What's the background to the downward dog?
Oh, so I mean they've got
all these there are these positions, the names of positions, that they must have these.
Sure. So the downward dog, I mean, and that was quite interesting today in the yoga class I went to at the Indian Embassy in Tokyo, because we did a round of Surya Namaskara, which is this, the 12 salutes to the sun, and you do in that sequence, you do the downward dog, and he didn't use the downward dog name. He called it by its other name, Parvatasana, which is the mountain pose. So, I mean, basically these postures are kind of, they're modeled off what people have seen animals doing, and today you can buy an encyclopedia that's like, maybe half a meter thick with glossy, full color photos of all these postures. But, they're all quite recent things. I mean, if you go all the way back to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which were written maybe 1,500 years ago, he only mentions a couple of postures, and none of them have anything to do with Surya Namaskar or dog or mountain pose. They're basically postures for sitting in, cross-legged meditation, because it's a completely different application of yoga. And yeah, so I mean, these postures are just made up. I mean, and to me, I mean, as an anthropologist, I'm not trying to prescribe or anything. I'm not trying to say. I think that the whole world of modern global yoga is fascinating. You've got beer yoga, goat yoga, penguin yoga, weed yoga, death metal yoga. I mean, there are all these different types of
Facebook yoga. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, that was interesting about Facebook. I mean, how do people do yoga on Facebook? Like they talk. What do they do on? So you're saying about these Facebook groups. I mean, what can you do on Facebook? Is they comment? Do they? That's
Look, each of these groups is quite different, and they might have specific rules about what you can and cannot do. I mean,
in terms of their practice of yoga, or in terms of what they do with the group.
Within the group, yeah. So, for instance, there's one that's called Yoga Teachers,
okay,
and that has like 23,000 members or something. And so, you're actually not allowed to self-promote. You're not allowed to, put any adverts about your own workshops or your classes. It's meant to be a resource for yoga teachers all around the world who can ask a question and, maybe get feedback. And a lot of these, I mean, a lot of the stuff is quite naive. I think in the sense that you've got people who are. I mean, first of all, you're meant to be a yoga teacher to join that group.
Do you have to do you have to apply? Like the administrator has to approve you?
Yeah, exactly.
They check your credentials?
Well, the administrator doesn't. I mean, there's 20,000 people. But the idea is that you're at least interested in yoga. And
you're prepared to call yourself a yoga teacher?
Yeah. Some people don't want to call themselves yoga teachers. Yeah, so you can't promote yourself, but you can ask questions, and some of these questions are really quite interesting. Others are, like I said, they're interesting, but I mean they're valid for that person, right? But I mean, like I remember there was one debate that ensued about music. The playing of music in yoga studios. So, I mean, a lot of people just don't know that if you buy an MP3 or a CD or whatever, you can't just go play that publicly and make money using it. And that's what a lot of yoga teachers do. They, these days, I mean, you take your iPhone, you just plug it into the stereo at the studio, you play music. Yeah. That's infringing on copyright, right? And a lot of people don't realize that, or they don't care about it, And so there was a really interesting conversation that lasted several days, and it got really interesting when you had people who were musicians and yoga teachers who were able to kind of give their, two cents on it and put a lot of people straight in terms of, you're ripping us off. And then you got into the world of, getting a Spotify subscription. You can't just use your own personal one. You have to get a business one. Right. So that's one example of what it does. But there are other groups and there are groups within groups as well. Like you've got this 20,000 group, and then you've got, another group that might only have like 500 people. And then there's an even smaller group, again, of distilled, possibly like the more cynical and skeptical, of maybe only 30 people who... And then you've got groups that are basically competing against each other as well. For, there was a new group that got set up recently of basically all these other people who have been kicked out of these other groups, more or less for putting their hand up and, saying that something's not right or this and that. And the administrators just said, no, you're causing too many ripples. And so a lot of people got banned from these groups. So I try and stay kind of neutral and obey the rules. So I've never been kicked out of a group, but yeah, so people aren't practicing yoga. What they're doing,
they're talking about how to do it and what you should be doing or shouldn't be doing, or what you could be doing or not doing.
I mean, a lot of the conversations end up being more or less, let's say, rationalists arguing with people who support very much a lot of unqualified and unverifiable pseudoscientific claims about yoga that rely on several logical fallacies to kind of try and prop up an argument. And so there are some people who are, let's just say they enjoy arguing as a rhetorical kind of...
Well, there's a lot of those people on Facebook.
Yeah. And even though... And I'm not talking about just slinging ad hominem attacks. I'm talking about actually people that and they know how to argue. And I mean, I'm one of these people, and so I enjoy trying to pick apart an argument. And I also find it quite cathartic in a sense as well, because it challenges me to think about my own writing as well. And so I use it as a source of, collecting data. And I think now in most of these groups, people know who I am.
Okay.
But initially there was I was quite, I'm doing this for research, but you can't tell 20,000 people, I mean, this is when I was saying this ethical stuff. So when I had a article published about politics beyond the yoga mat with Global Ethnographic last year, there was a bit of a backlash from people in some of these groups who were like, you never told us that. I said, well, I mean, I tried. I really did try, but then you can also, if you get deep down into the legal stuff of Facebook and what you've actually signed up to, I mean, once you press send, you've more or less consented to things like that. So, and a lot of people don't accept that, but
they think it's a personal conversation that they're having with someone,
with 20,000 other people. Yeah, right. I mean, if you were out in a public space, you have the right to film. You don't need anyone's permission. And I basically take the line that if you're in a Facebook group with 20,000 people, you might as well be standing in the middle of Tokyo metro station, having an argument. So other people might disagree with me, but I mean, that's
your position. Yeah.
That's my position.
Yeah, it seems to me that the way that yoga is, I mean, it must be incredibly difficult to define. I can understand what you're saying, because I've been to a couple of yoga classes myself in Australia, actually in Japan as well, and in Hawaii. And the one in Hawaii that I remember the most was this woman who said, "Well, you can lean back and stretch like this if you want, or not." And it was like, I mean, I don't know what she called that yoga, but I had my own name for it, which was apathetic yoga.
Right.
It was like, you can do that or don't, whatever. And it just seems that to, I guess, the discussion about the Facebook groups and so on, in some ways, I guess, some people would be trying to claim legitimacy and claim a certain, through the knowledge that they have in the practice, I guess. Is that the case? Do you see that a fair bit in these terms of global yoga? Like how? Yeah,
there's a lot to say, but there's an interesting kind of what do they call them? An infographic. Let's just say a poster that kind of charts the family tree of all these different styles of modern postural yoga.
Okay.
And they all trace back to people like Krishnamacharya and some of the people like Patabi Joyce and BKS Iyengar and all this sort of stuff. So this like Mysore style of yoga, which for many people is, they consider it to be this is the real yoga kind of thing. But it's even like you can't. I would actually say that like this Mysore style of yoga it's quite different to like an Indian idea of yoga, because I think for a lot of Indians, yoga is not really stretching. Yoga it's more the meditation and the breathing practices, but actually yoga is more of like a way of life in a sense. It's a lifestyle, and so this is how yoga is commodified in globally. I mean, it's aspirational in that sense. That yoga promises something. It promises connection. It promises this kind of this ability to feel that the world could be better. That we could bring people together in a way that the world could be more eco-sustainable and things like this. And it's interesting, if you actually step back and kind of like think about the rhetoric involved in the marketing of yoga from like the yoga industry and also from the Indian government and the tourism and stuff like this, you actually see that yoga doesn't live up to what it promises, or the promises of the people that say that yoga brings people together and all this stuff. Because if you actually look at the statistics, overwhelming, like 90% of people who practice yoga are women. In a Western world, I mean, it's totally different here in Japan, so it doesn't really pan out here, but overwhelmingly it's something that white people do. And so people of color, there's an issue there. In Australia now, there's one yoga company that's called Fat Yoga. Fat Yoga for fat people is their slogan, right? So people who are overweight or who don't fit, the glamorous kind of bronze tan thing, marginalized, and also, I mean, I don't know, also. From an economic point of view, I mean, yoga is exceptionally something that it's a middle class and up thing. I mean, to go to a yoga class here, it's 2,500 yen, 3,000 yen just for one class. I mean, this is not a price that I don't think. I mean, you need to have some economic vitality for disposable income and not just that, you've got to buy the $120 Lululemon yoga pants and $200 yoga mat and all this stuff. So it's not cheap. So it actually, in many ways, excludes a lot of people. There's also this aspect of doing things correctly, and so you get this really serious type of yoga practitioner, not just in Japan. I mean, some of these styles of yoga, they lend themselves to, I guess, the masochist in a certain way. That, I mean, there is actually this idea that in amongst some of these like Ashtanga kind of yoga people, that you haven't really started yoga until you've like blown both your knees out. I mean, I've been trying. I mean, one thing I want to do is quantify as well as qualify yoga in Japan. So at the moment, I want to create a map with so you could just zoom in on Japan, and here's all the yoga studios. I think it would be interesting to see, just visually what's going on. But then I think I could use that to kind of get to a deeper level of analysis and look at the geographic distribution of, where yoga studios are kind of concentrated. And there's one suburb apparently in kind of near Shibuya in Tokyo that's meant to have, according to one list, more yoga studios than anywhere else, and things like this. So yeah, that would be interesting. So at the moment, I'm trying to learn about scraper bots. That scrape data from websites and things like this. So I am an absolute Luddite with a lot of technological things. So I'm trying to find the time, because the other option is that I manually enter this data into an Excel spreadsheet, and I calculated, like, let's say there's, the 1,500 yoga studios in Japan. It takes roughly about 3 minutes to enter each yoga studio. So that's one thing I want to do. The other thing is just to go around to as many yoga studios and talk to the teachers, talk to their students and things like this. But a lot of people are quite suspicious of academics, I think, trying to intrude in their lives and turn them into, lab rats in a sense, which I understand. So, and this takes time to build up rapport, and which is frustrating. I mean, I just want to walk in there and then tell me now, what I have to go. I've got 4 more yoga studios today on my list. I mean, that would be ideal, but, that's not going to happen. So one frustrating thing has been actually just trying to cold call yoga studios. You just type into to Google Maps as well, yoga studios in Nagoya, for instance. It'll bring up a bunch of yoga studios, and then I've got a little pre-written paragraph, and hi, my name's Patrick, I'm in Kyoto, this is my website, yogascapesinjapan.com. I'd love to just have a quick chat with you, and I would say less than 50% even bother responding. So what I'm hoping and what's starting to happen is, I meet some yoga teacher, they realize that I'm not so scary. And they offer to hook me up with their friends who are yoga teachers, and so this is basically, I think, how it's going to roll, and we'll see after 2 years. But my instincts are, you look at magazines like the Yoga Journal or the Japan version of the Yoga Journal, and the Yoga Journal has been around for maybe 30 years or something. It's based, I think, in California, and there's another one in Japan I've never seen before. I only saw it yesterday. It's called Yogini. Very similar. It's more or less a fashion mag that's sprinkled with pictures of people doing yoga. And it'll have some feature article about some yoga teacher, and give you a bunch of yoga retreats or yoga festivals. Like there's one down in Okinawa called Okinawa Satsang. It's a multi-day kind of yoga focused festival with yoga. You can try all different things related to yoga. There'll be people selling their yoga clothing, and it's probably exceptionally vegetarian or even vegan. I'm interested to get a broad perspective on yoga in Japan.
Great. Well, Patrick McCartney, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and good luck with your research.
I look forward to telling you more about it later.
Okay. You've been listening to Asian Ethnology Podcast. My name is Ben Dorman. You can access Asian Ethnology Podcast through iTunes and iHeartRadio. Thank you very much.